I'll never forget the day I opened a letter and found out my family's 200 acres, the land my grandfather worked so hard for, was sold, but not by us. No, by some company and the HOA. They used a legal loophole or whatever, and just like that, it was gone. Seriously, I couldn't believe it. I mean, who does that, right? But here's the thing, they didn't know who they were messing with. I wasn't going to let that slide. This is the story of how I took matters into my own hands. Let me know in the comments what you would do if you found out your land was poof gone like that. I couldn't believe it. 200 acres of land inherited from my grandfather, built with his sweat and determination, was sold for a mere $50,000. It felt like a part of me had been stolen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and for some reason, my stomach turned as I saw the official letterhead. I wasn't expecting anything from the tax office since I'd paid everything on time and kept my property in decent shape for over a decade. The envelope felt heavier than usual, though, which should have been my first warning sign that trouble was brewing. I poured my coffee and sat down at the kitchen table to read whatever bureaucratic nonsense they dreamed up this time. What I found was so completely absurd, I actually laughed out loud. Though, looking back, maybe I should have taken it more seriously from the start. The paper felt heavier than I imagined as I scanned the bold, cold text. My heart sank as I read the words that would change everything. The lien on your property has been transferred to Pinterest Development Corporation. The words felt like a punch to the gut. How could my land, something I'd owned and maintained for over a decade, suddenly belong to some corporation I'd never heard of? My grandfather had spent his entire life turning raw, untamed land into something beautiful, something to pass down to me. He'd always told me, "This land is freedom. Don't let anyone take it from you." I had to read that sentence 3 times before it actually sank in because the words seemed so disconnected from reality. Looking out my kitchen window toward the sprawling acreage where my grandfather had built everything from scratch, I tried to understand what had triggered this sudden seizure of property that had been in my family for generations. The morning was perfect with that crisp air that makes you remember why you chose to live here. As I approached the fields that my grandfather had cleared by hand, I tried to see my property through the eyes of these mysterious corporate interests who had supposedly acquired legal ownership. The land was well maintained, recently surveyed, and certainly no burden by any reasonable standard. The boundaries were clearly marked and organized, and I'd always been careful about keeping my taxes current and property records updated. Nothing about the entire situation screamed delinquent taxes to me. But then again, I'm apparently not sophisticated enough to understand the nuanced legal mechanisms that Pinterest Development had employed. I walked around my property for 20 minutes comparing what I saw to what the legal documents claimed and honestly couldn't see how a $50,000 tax lien could justify seizing land worth over $2 million. There were no unpaid assessments, no outstanding violations, no legitimate basis for any kind of property seizure that I could identify. Some sections were clearly more valuable than others, but all seemed to coexist peacefully in this little rural community that I'd called home for most of my adult life. The really insulting part came in the next paragraph, where they claimed to have followed proper legal procedures for tax lien recovery and property acquisition. Proper legal procedures. My 200 acres that had supported my family for 3 generations was apparently acquired through some bureaucratic process that I'd never been notified about or given opportunity to contest. I looked through every piece of mail I'd received for the past year, searching for any notification or warning about pending tax issues or property liens. Catherine Sterling was mentioned prominently in the legal documentation, identified as the HOA representative who had facilitated the property transfer on behalf of the community's development interests. Catherine had been HOA president for about 3 years now, ever since she moved here from somewhere up north with her perfectly organized life and strong opinions about community development. She was one of those perfectly put-together women in her mid-50s who always looked like she was heading to an important business meeting, even when she was just checking her mail or walking her small designer dog. The way the documents described the property acquisition process made it sound like I was harboring some kind of community liability instead of simply owning productive agricultural land that had been in my family for generations. Ms. Sterling, I need to understand what exactly happened with my property, I said when I called the HOA office, trying to keep my voice neutral and professional despite my growing shock and confusion. She responded with that practice tone that never quite conveyed genuine concern or empathy for property owners facing unexpected legal challenges. Well, as you can see from the documentation, the property was subject to outstanding tax obligations that required immediate resolution through established legal procedures. She said, as if the issues were completely obvious to anyone with functioning understanding of municipal finance and property law. I looked through all my records again, genuinely trying to understand what tax obligations she was referring to and find any evidence of delinquent payments or outstanding assessments. Ms. Sterling, I have receipts showing all my taxes were paid on time, and I never received any notification about outstanding obligations or pending legal action. Her response revealed something calculated and evasive underneath the polished professional exterior. Mr. Walker, sometimes property ownership involves complex legal obligations that go beyond simple tax payments, and your land was subject to special assessments that required prompt resolution through appropriate channels. And that phrase about special assessments stuck with me because it basically admitted they had imposed charges that I'd never been notified about or given opportunity to contest. Then I suggest you show me documentation of these special assessments, Ms. Sterling. Right now, based on everything I can find, this property seizure appears to be completely fraudulent. The conversation went downhill from there, with Catherine insisting that reasonable property owners would understand the need for compliance with municipal development requirements, while I kept pointing out that reasonable people would follow clearly established legal procedures and provide proper notification. She mentioned something about legal authority and enforcement mechanisms that were available to development corporations, but I'd stopped listening carefully by then because my attention was focused on a detail I just noticed about the property transfer documentation. The paperwork wasn't just a mistake or bureaucratic error when I really examined it closely, and the legal language seemed oddly specific and targeted for something that was supposed to be routine tax lien enforcement. There were references to community development priorities and strategic land use optimization that you'd never see in standard municipal tax collection procedures. I made a mental note to investigate these discrepancies further, though I wasn't sure why they seemed so important at the time. After Catherine hung up abruptly, clearly frustrated by my unwillingness to simply accept the property seizure, I spent another hour examining the legal documentation. Everything looked professionally prepared and legally formatted, but something definitely felt wrong about the entire process and the timing of this supposed tax lien. The more I thought about the conversation and her evasive answers, the more questions I had about who actually had authority to seize private property and whether these procedures had any legitimate legal basis. The paper now in my hands wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate act. Someone with power had targeted my family's land. I couldn't let it go, not like this. When I called Ben, I didn't expect comfort. He'd seen corruption before, but when I told him what had happened, I heard the hesitation in his voice that suggested this situation was more serious than either of us had initially realized. This isn't just about a few misplaced tax forms, Timber. You're up against something much bigger than simple bureaucratic incompetence or clerical errors. The concern in his voice made me realize that my family's property seizure might be part of a larger pattern of questionable legal activities targeting landowners throughout the region. Ben Martinez had been practicing property law for over 20 years, specializing in disputes involving municipal tax collection and development corporation acquisitions. His experience with similar cases gave him insight into the tactics and procedures that were commonly used to acquire private property through questionable legal mechanisms. These Pinterest development cases are becoming more frequent, he explained during our meeting. They use complex legal language to confuse property owners and accelerate acquisition timelines before anyone can mount effective resistance or legal challenges. His office walls were lined with case files from similar disputes. The documentation he showed me revealed a disturbing pattern of property seizures that followed identical procedures and legal justifications across multiple rural communities throughout the state. Property owners would receive minimal notification about special assessments or tax obligations, followed by expedited legal proceedings that transferred ownership to development corporations within weeks, rather than the months or years that legitimate tax lien processes typically required. The timing is always suspicious, Ben noted while reviewing my case documents. They target properties during periods when owners are least likely to notice or respond quickly to legal challenges. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes became my first significant source of information about the broader scope of Pinterest Development's activities in our community and surrounding areas. Mrs. Hayes wasn't just a concerned neighbor, but someone who had watched others fall victim to the same tactics that were now being used against my family's property. They did the same to the Martinez family, she whispered during our conversation at the local diner. And they almost got me too. They won't stop until they own everything valuable in this entire county. Her weathered hands shook as she pulled out newspaper clippings from previous cases. Her knowledge of previous cases provided crucial insight into the methods and timeline that Pinterest Development typically employed when targeting properties for acquisition. The Martinez family had lost 80 acres of prime agricultural land through a nearly identical process involving mysterious special assessments and expedited legal proceedings. The Martinez family never received proper notification, Mrs. Hayes explained. They found out about the property seizure when surveyors showed up to begin development planning for their former land. She'd kept detailed records of every suspicious transaction in the county for the past 5 years. As I spoke with more people throughout the community, I realized this wasn't an isolated case targeting my family specifically. The same tactics were being used on multiple families in the area, always following the same pattern of mistaken addresses, hidden notices, and expedited auctions that seemed designed to prevent property owners from mounting effective legal challenges. Mistaken addresses meant that legal notifications were sent to wrong locations, ensuring that property owners wouldn't receive timely warning about pending legal action. Several families had discovered their losses only when construction crews appeared on their former property. Hidden notices involved posting legal requirements in obscure locations where property owners were unlikely to see them, technically satisfying legal notification requirements while practically ensuring that affected families wouldn't learn about proceedings until after critical deadlines had passed. Expedited auctions compressed normal legal timelines, giving property owners insufficient time to secure legal representation or gather financial resources needed to contest questionable tax assessments or property seizures. It wasn't a coincidence that all these factors worked together so consistently across different cases. The coordination was sophisticated and deliberate. The pattern was clearly coordinated and systematically implemented, rather than resulting from random bureaucratic incompetence or isolated corruption. Catherine Sterling's name appeared in documentation related to multiple property acquisitions throughout the region, always in her capacity as HOA representative or community development consultant. Her involvement suggested that someone was using HOA authority and community development rhetoric to provide legal cover for what appeared to be systematic property theft targeting rural landowners. Each transaction generated substantial profits while technically following legal procedures. I started maintaining detailed records of every conversation, document, and piece of evidence related to my case and the broader pattern of questionable property acquisitions. Documentation would be crucial, If this situation escalated to formal legal proceedings or regulatory investigations involving multiple government agencies. Every phone call was logged with time, date, and detailed summary of what was discussed and what commitments or threats were made by various parties involved in the property seizure process. My dining room table became covered with organized files and timelines that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. The courthouse research revealed additional disturbing information about the scope and sophistication of Pinterest Development's operations throughout our region. Property records showed that the corporation had acquired over 3,000 acres of prime rural land during the past 18 months, always through similar legal mechanisms involving special assessments and expedited tax lien procedures. The total value of acquired properties exceeded $15 million, representing a substantial business operation rather than isolated cases of legitimate tax collection. Each acquisition followed the same playbook with minor variations to avoid obvious patterns. Municipal records showed that Catherine Sterling had been appointed to development review committees in 4 different counties, giving her access to advanced information about planned infrastructure projects and zoning changes that would significantly increase property values. Her position allowed her to identify valuable properties before other potential buyers became aware of development opportunities, creating unfair advantages in the property acquisition process. She had systematically positioned herself in key roles that provided insider access to confidential planning information, worth millions in potential profits. Legal research into special assessment procedures revealed that Pinterest Development was exploiting ambiguous language in municipal codes to impose charges on property owners without following standard notification and appeals processes. The assessments were technically legal, but practically impossible for property owners to contest within the compressed timelines established by expedited legal procedures. This is sophisticated legal manipulation, Ben explained after reviewing the municipal codes. They've found loopholes that allow them to seize property while technically following legal procedures. The legal framework had been carefully crafted to provide procedural cover for systematic theft. I didn't expect what came next when I continued reviewing courthouse records late into the evening. A name hastily scrawled on the last page of a contract I found buried in the property trance. For documentation revealed Catherine Sterling's personal connection to Pinterest Development Corporation that went far beyond her official role as HOA representative. The handwritten notation indicated personal financial interest in development projects that created obvious conflicts of interest with her community leadership responsibilities. The signature matched her handwriting from HOA documents I'd seen previously. It was all connected through financial relationships and business partnerships that weren't disclosed in any public documentation. And now I was in over my head with a conspiracy that involved far more money and political influence than I had initially realized. At first it was subtle, a car parked across the street, someone watching me from a cafe window, the same person appearing in different locations where I was conducting research about my property case. But as I continued my investigation into Pinterest Development's activities, I realized this wasn't coincidence or paranoid imagination on my part. Someone was keeping an eye on me, and it wasn't just casual interest in the property dispute that had been escalating over the past several weeks. The surveillance became more obvious as I expanded my research into municipal records and interviewed other property owners who had faced similar legal challenges. The same dark sedan would appear in courthouse parking lots when I was reviewing public records, and the same individual would be visible near the coffee shop where I met with Ben to discuss legal strategy. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental, suggesting that someone with resources was monitoring my activities and reporting back to interested parties. My growing paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded when I started noticing additional signs that my investigation was generating concern among people who preferred to conduct business without public scrutiny. Phone calls would sometimes have unusual background noises or brief delays that suggested monitoring equipment, and my internet searches about property, law, and development. Corporation activities seemed to trigger increased promotional emails from legal services and property management companies that I'd never contacted or expressed interest in. The psychological pressure was becoming noticeable as I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and questioning whether ordinary interactions with neighbors or service providers might be related to the property dispute. Sleep became more difficult as I worried about what might happen if I continued pushing for answers about questionable legal procedures and corporate activities that clearly involved substantial financial interests and political connections that I didn't fully understand yet. The break-in at my house was the escalation I'd been dreading, but somehow still felt unprepared for when it actually happened. I arrived home to find the door wide open with no signs of forced entry that would suggest random burglary or opportunistic theft by local criminals. Inside the house was systematically searched rather than randomly vandalized, with papers torn and scattered across the floor in patterns that suggested someone had been looking for specific documents or information. But what made my stomach churn was the deliberate destruction of my grandfather's keepsakes that had obvious sentimental value but no practical worth to ordinary thieves. Family photographs were torn and scattered. Handwritten letters from my grandfather were shredded, and personal mementos that represented decades of family history were broken or deliberately damaged in ways that seemed designed to send an emotional message rather than simply steal valuable items. They weren't just after information about my legal case or financial resources that might be used to contest the property seizure. They wanted to erase everything that connected me to my family's legacy and the emotional foundation that was motivating my resistance to their acquisition efforts. The message was clear that this conflict was personal as well as financial, and that continued resistance would result in escalating attacks on everything I valued beyond just the property itself. The destruction felt calculated to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about who was responsible for the break-in. Nothing was stolen that would clearly indicate the motivation behind the intrusion, and the damage could theoretically be attributed to random vandalism or local teenagers, rather than corporate interests trying to intimidate property owners who were asking too many questions about questionable legal procedures. Police response to the break-in report was professionally courteous, but obviously limited by the lack of physical evidence or clear criminal activity that could be prosecuted under normal legal procedures. The investigating officer took photographs and filed appropriate paperwork, but made it clear that without witnesses or physical evidence linking specific individuals to the crime, there was little likelihood of identifying suspects or recovering damaged property. "This looks like someone was searching for something specific," the officer noted while examining the pattern of damage throughout the house. "But without knowing what they were looking for or whether they found it, there's not much we can do beyond filing the report and recommending improved security measures." His suggestion to install security cameras and upgrade door locks was practical, but didn't address the underlying issue that someone with resources was willing to escalate illegal tactics to discourage my investigation. The timing of the break-in occurring just days after I discovered Catherine Sterling's personal financial connections to Pinehurst development was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone wanted to demonstrate that continued investigation would have personal consequences beyond just losing the property dispute. The message was intended to make me reconsider whether pursuing legal action was worth the potential risks to my personal safety and emotional well-being. But the intimidation tactics had an unexpected effect that probably wasn't part of their original plan. Instead of discouraging my investigation, the break-in convinced me that I was getting close to discovering something significant that justified the resources they were investing in surveillance and intimidation. People don't typically escalate to illegal tactics unless they're protecting valuable assets or trying to conceal serious legal violations. My research into Catherine Sterling's background revealed additional connections that explained why she might be willing to take substantial risks to protect Pinehurst Development's property acquisition activities. She had previously worked for several development corporations in other states, always in community relations or government liaison roles that required building relationships with local officials and community leaders who could facilitate expedited approval processes for controversial projects. Her experience with navigating local politics and community resistance suggested that the current situation was part of a well-developed business model rather than an isolated case of opportunistic property acquisition. The break-in had probably been intended to end my investigation before I could uncover the full scope of her previous activities or identify other communities where similar tactics had been employed to acquire valuable properties. As I dug deeper into courthouse records and cross-referenced them with property transfer documentation, I found something more sinister than I'd expected when I started this investigation. A folder hidden under my father's old desk and somehow overlooked during the break-in contained letters about land acquisitions that revealed advanced planning for property seizures throughout the region. I couldn't believe what I was reading as I examined decade-old correspondence that showed systematic targeting of rural properties. Pinehurst Development had been in talks with local officials for years, developing relationships and legal frameworks that would enable large-scale property acquisition through special assessment procedures that most property owners wouldn't understand or be able to contest effectively. This wasn't just about a few bad actors exploiting bureaucratic loopholes for isolated financial gain. It was a full-blown conspiracy involving corporate interests, local government officials, and community leaders who were systematically transferring private property to development corporations through questionable legal mechanisms that generated substantial profits for connected insiders. Ben warned me about the risks of escalating this dispute into a public confrontation with corporate interests who had substantial legal resources and political connections at their disposal. You're not just fighting for your land anymore, Timber. You're up against corporate giants with lawyers and money and political influence that you can't match in a direct legal battle. But I wasn't backing down from a fight that had already cost me my family's property and my peace of mind. I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing the systematic corruption. His caution was framed not as defeatist pessimism, but as pragmatic warning about the legal and personal costs of challenging powerful interests who were accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and procedural manipulation rather than legitimate legal processes. The personal risks go beyond just losing the property dispute, Ben explained during our strategy session. These people have demonstrated willingness to use illegal tactics like surveillance and break-ins. Public confrontation might escalate their response in ways we can't predict or prepare for effectively. The internal conflict about how far I was willing to go to fight this systematic corruption became the defining question that would determine my approach to seeking justice for my family and other victims of similar property seizures. Fighting back would require exposing myself to retaliation and legal expenses that could destroy my financial stability, even if I ultimately won the property dispute. But accepting the loss would validate their tactics and encourage continued targeting of other rural property owners who lacked resources to resist. Preparing for the HOA meeting required organizing years of evidence into a compelling narrative that would convince community members to support investigation into Catherine Sterling's activities and her relationship with Pinehurst Development. The documentation needed to be clear enough for ordinary residents to understand the scope of the conspiracy while detailed enough to demonstrate systematic, rather than isolated corruption involving multiple properties and communities throughout the region. Gina Martinez became my most valuable ally when she agreed to provide inside information about Pinehurst Development's internal operations and decision-making processes. Gina was trembling when she handed me the envelope containing financial records and internal communications that revealed the true scope of their property acquisition strategy. "I've been watching this for years," she said, her voice shaking with fear and determination. "I can't let them keep doing this to people. But if they find out I've been helping you, I'll lose everything. My job, my livelihood, everything I've worked for." Her backstory involved years of working in financial administration for development corporations, giving her access to internal communications and strategic planning documents that revealed how these property acquisition schemes were organized and implemented. Her knowledge of corporate corruption rather than just bureaucratic incompetence provided crucial insight into the business model that made systematic property theft profitable for connected insiders while maintaining legal cover through complex procedural requirements. Her fear and personal risk stemmed from the substantial power these corporate interests wielded over employment opportunities and professional reputations in the local development industry. Speaking out against Pinterest development would essentially end her career in financial administration and could result in legal retaliation if her access to confidential information was discovered by corporate security or legal departments that monitored employee activities for potential breaches of confidentiality agreements. The evidence she provided included internal emails discussing strategic targeting of rural properties with elderly owners who would be less likely to understand complex legal procedures or have resources to mount effective legal challenges. Focus on properties with aging owners who have strong emotional attachments but limited financial resources. One email stated, "Emotional attachment makes them vulnerable to pressure tactics while limited resources prevent effective legal resistance." Additional documentation revealed that Catherine Sterling received substantial financial compensation for facilitating property acquisitions through her positions in various HOA boards and community development committees throughout the region. Her role was to identify valuable properties, gather intelligence about property owners' financial situations and legal vulnerabilities, and create community support for development projects that would benefit Pinterest Development's business interests rather than actual community welfare. The public confrontation at the HOA meeting attracted over 100 community members, more than had attended any previous meeting in the association's history. Word had spread through the neighborhood about potential corruption involving community leadership and questionable property acquisitions that could affect property values and community stability. Residents wanted answers about how their association was being used to facilitate private business interests that might conflict with genuine community welfare and property rights. When Catherine stood in front of the crowd, her smile never wavered, despite the obvious tension and skepticism known from community members who were learning about her financial relationship with Pinterest Development for the first time. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she prepared to defend activities that were becoming increasingly difficult to justify as legitimate community service. She wasn't here to protect community interests or provide transparent leadership. She was here to protect her investments and business relationships that depended on maintaining community support for development projects that generated substantial profits for connected insiders while potentially harming property rights and community character. Her practiced presentation skills and political experience gave her advantages in managing public opinion, but the documented evidence of financial conflicts of interest would be difficult to explain away with rhetoric about community development and property value enhancement. My presentation of evidence focused on the documented pattern of property seizures, the financial relationships between Catherine Sterling and Pinterest Development, and the systematic targeting of rural landowners through questionable legal procedures that violated established norms for municipal tax collection and property acquisition. The timeline and documentation demonstrated coordination rather than coincidence, suggesting criminal conspiracy rather than isolated cases of bureaucratic incompetence or legal error. Community reaction was divided between residents who were shocked by the evidence of systematic corruption and others who preferred to avoid confrontation that might result in legal expenses and community conflict. Some residents expressed gratitude for exposing potential fraud that could have affected their own properties, while others worried that challenging powerful corporate interests might result in retaliation against the entire community through legal action or political pressure. The evidence was overwhelming enough to convince most community members that immediate action was necessary to protect community interests and individual property rights from continued exploitation by connected insiders who were using HOA authority for private financial gain. But Catherine's response revealed the sophisticated legal and political resources that she could deploy to maintain control over the narrative and minimize consequences for her previous activities. Just when I thought I had made my case and gained community support for investigating Catherine Sterling's conflicts of interest, she dropped a bombshell that shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. She looked at me straight in the eyes with cold calculation and said, "You don't know who you're messing with, Mr. Walker. You're playing a dangerous game, and you're about to lose everything you think you're fighting for." It was a warning that revealed the scope of resources and connections that she could mobilize against anyone who threatened her business interests. But I wasn't about to back down from a fight that had already cost me everything I'd inherited from my grandfather, and threatened the financial security of other community members who trusted local leadership to protect their interests rather than exploit them for private gain. I wasn't going to back down from this fight that had already consumed months of my life and threatened everything my family had built over 3 generations. The corruption ran deeper than I ever thought possible. And now I was up against more than just the HOA board and Catherine Sterling's questionable leadership decisions. I was facing a network of corporations, politicians, and developers who'd been stealing land from families for years through systematic exploitation of legal loopholes and procedural manipulation that most property owners couldn't understand or effectively contest within compressed legal timelines. The decision to escalate this dispute into formal legal warfare wasn't made lightly, considering the substantial financial resources and legal expertise that would be required to challenge corporate interests with established political connections and regulatory relationships. Ben had warned me repeatedly about the personal and financial costs of mounting a comprehensive legal challenge against Pinterest Development and their network of connected insiders who controlled significant aspects of local government and development approval processes throughout the region. "You know what you're up against, right?" Ben asked during our strategy session, his voice heavy with worry and professional concern about the scope of resources we'd be facing in formal legal proceedings. "They have lawyers, money, and political clout that exceeds anything we can match in a direct confrontation. You'll be fighting for more than just your family's land and property rights. This is a war you might not be able to win, and the personal costs could destroy your financial stability, even if we ultimately prove systematic corruption." His caution was based on years of experience with similar cases involving development corporations that used aggressive legal tactics and procedural manipulation to discourage property owners from pursuing legitimate claims through formal court proceedings. Financial resources required for comprehensive legal action could easily exceed the value of recovered property, creating situations where winning legal battles resulted in personal financial ruin for property owners who couldn't afford extended litigation against well-funded corporate defendants. But my determination to pursue justice went beyond simple financial calculations about property values and legal expenses. This was about preventing other families from losing their generational property through the same systematic fraud that had targeted my grandfather's land and threatened the financial security of rural communities throughout the region. The principle of property rights and legal accountability was worth fighting for regardless of personal costs, especially when the alternative was allowing systematic corruption to continue unchallenged. The first court hearing revealed the sophisticated legal strategy that Catherine Sterling and Pinterest Development had prepared to defend their property acquisition activities and discredit my claims of systematic fraud and procedural violations. Their legal team consisted of 5 attorneys from a prestigious law firm that specialized in municipal law and development corporation defense, representing legal resources that far exceeded anything I could afford through conventional legal representation. The hearing was brutal and professionally intimidating in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated. Despite Ben's warnings about the aggressive tactics commonly employed by corporate legal teams, Catherine's lawyers attacked every point of our case, systematically looking for any weakness they could exploit to undermine the credibility of our evidence and legal arguments. They had all the resources they needed to twist facts, challenge procedures, and create reasonable doubt about the systematic nature of the corruption we documented through months of investigation. Their strategy focused on portraying my case as isolated grievance from a disgruntled property owner who couldn't accept legitimate legal procedures for tax collection and municipal assessment enforcement. They argued that special assessments were properly authorized under existing municipal codes, that notification procedures had been followed according to established legal requirements, and that property transfers had been completed through legitimate auction processes that provided adequate opportunity for contest and appeal. The legal technicalities they cited were impressive and professionally presented, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of municipal law and property acquisition procedures that made their arguments sound reasonable to judges who weren't familiar with the broader pattern of systematic exploitation. Their ability to cite specific legal precedents and procedural requirements created an appearance of legitimacy that was difficult to counter without equally sophisticated legal expertise and comprehensive documentation. But our evidence of systematic targeting and procedural manipulation was compelling enough to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of Pinehurst Development's activities and Catherine Sterling's role in facilitating questionable property acquisitions. The timeline and documentation we presented demonstrated coordination rather than coincidence, suggesting criminal conspiracy rather than isolated cases of legitimate tax collection and property transfer procedures. The judge's response to our evidence was cautiously interested but professionally reserved, indicating that further investigation would be required to determine whether systematic violations had occurred or whether individual cases represented isolated examples of aggressive but legal property acquisition tactics. Her decision to order discovery proceedings and allow expanded investigation suggested that our evidence had raised legitimate concerns about potential fraud and procedural violations. Catherine Sterling's reaction to the judge's decision revealed the first signs of genuine concern about the potential consequences of continued legal scrutiny and regulatory investigation. Her confident demeanor faltered slightly when the judge authorized comprehensive review of Pinehurst Development's financial records and business practices, suggesting that formal legal proceedings might expose activities that couldn't withstand detailed examination by regulatory authorities. The discovery process would provide access to internal communications and financial documentation that could reveal the true scope of systematic property acquisition activities and the financial relationships between corporate interests and local government officials. This level of transparency would be dangerous for any operation that depended on secrecy and procedural manipulation to maintain legal cover for questionable business practices. As the hearing ended, I received an anonymous tip that changed everything about how I understood the scope of corruption and political connections that were protecting Pinehurst Development's activities. A name linked to Catherine's operation appeared in a handwritten note that had been slipped into my briefcase during the courthouse proceedings. A key figure in the local government had direct financial ties to her development projects, creating conflicts of interest that went far beyond simple regulatory capture or political influence. This wasn't just about land acquisition anymore. It was about systematic corruption involving elected officials who were using their positions to facilitate private business interests at the expense of constituent property rights, and I was going to expose it all regardless of the personal consequences. The FBI investigation was moving faster than I expected, with Special Agent Martinez making significant headway into the financial relationships and business practices that connected Pinehurst Development to local government corruption. The federal investigation had expanded beyond simple property fraud to include potential violations of federal racketeering statutes and conspiracy charges that could result in substantial prison sentences for everyone involved in the systematic land acquisition scheme. Tyler Morrison's sudden emergence as a flight risk changed everything about the timeline and urgency of building a prosecutable case against the entire criminal organization. Tyler Morrison had been Catherine Sterling's business partner and financial coordinator for Pinehurst Development's property acquisition activities throughout the region, managing the complex financial transactions and legal procedures that enabled systematic property theft through municipal tax collection processes. His knowledge of internal operations and financial records made him a crucial witness for federal prosecution efforts, but also a significant liability for other conspirators who couldn't afford to have their activities exposed through his potential cooperation with federal investigators. The discovery of Tyler's flight preparations revealed the desperation and panic that were spreading through the criminal organization as federal investigation intensified and the scope of potential criminal charges became apparent to everyone involved. He had withdrawn hundreds of thousands in cash from multiple bank accounts and was booking a flight to Switzerland where extradition procedures would be complex and time-consuming even if federal prosecutors could build sufficient evidence for international criminal charges. His escape would end everything we'd worked for during months of investigation and legal proceedings, taking with him crucial evidence and insider knowledge that could expose the full scope of systematic corruption involving corporate interests and local government officials. All the documentation and testimony we'd gathered would become circumstantial rather than direct evidence without Tyler's cooperation and access to internal financial records that only he could provide to federal investigators. The urgency of preventing Tyler's escape created intense pressure on federal investigators to accelerate their timeline for arrests and evidence preservation before crucial witnesses and documentation could be destroyed or moved beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement. Special Agent Martinez was coordinating with multiple agencies to monitor Tyler's movements and prevent international flight, but the legal requirements for detention and evidence preservation created procedural constraints that limited their options for immediate action. Federal surveillance teams had been monitoring Tyler's activities for several days, documenting his attempts to liquidate assets and prepare for international flight while gathering evidence of criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. His behavior demonstrated consciousness of guilt and awareness that federal investigation was closing in on the systematic property acquisition scheme that had generated millions in illegal profits through exploitation of municipal legal procedures. The coordination between federal investigators and local law enforcement was complicated by potential corruption within local government agencies that might be compromised by financial relationships with Pinehurst Development and Catherine Sterling's political connections. Some local officials who had facilitated property transfers and special assessment procedures might be cooperating with federal investigation, while others could be actively obstructing evidence preservation and witness protection efforts. Catherine Sterling's reaction to news of federal investigation revealed the sophisticated legal and political resources she could deploy to minimize personal consequences and protect her business interests from criminal prosecution. Her legal team was already preparing defensive strategies that would challenge federal jurisdiction and procedural authority while attempting to characterize systematic property acquisition as legitimate business activities that didn't violate federal criminal statutes. But the evidence of interstate criminal conspiracy and systematic fraud was compelling enough to support federal racketeering charges that could result in substantial prison sentences and asset forfeiture proceedings that would recover stolen property and compensate victims of the land acquisition scheme. The scope of criminal activity involving multiple states and communities created federal jurisdiction that couldn't be challenged through local political connections or procedural manipulation. Tyler's knowledge of offshore financial accounts and international business relationships could expose additional layers of criminal activity involving money laundering and tax evasion that would support additional federal charges beyond simple property fraud and conspiracy. His cooperation with federal investigators could provide access to financial documentation and business communications that revealed the true scope of systematic corruption and criminal activity. The pressure on Tyler to cooperate with federal investigation was intense considering the potential criminal penalties he faced for his role in systematic property theft and financial fraud involving millions of dollars in stolen assets. Federal prosecutors were prepared to offer reduced sentences in exchange for comprehensive cooperation and testimony that could convict other members of the criminal organization and recover assets for victim compensation. But Tyler's flight preparations suggested that he believed escape was preferable to cooperation despite the substantial criminal penalties he would face if captured and prosecuted without the benefit of plea negotiations. His decision to flee rather than cooperate indicated either extreme confidence in his ability to avoid capture or extreme fear of retaliation from other members of the criminal organization who couldn't afford to have their activities exposed. The international implications of Tyler's escape would complicate federal prosecution efforts and potentially allow other members of the criminal organization to destroy evidence and flee before arrests could be made. Swiss banking secrecy laws and extradition procedures would make it difficult for federal investigators to access Tyler's financial records or secure his return for criminal prosecution within reasonable time frames. Clock was ticking as federal agents monitored Tyler's final preparations for international flight, knowing that once he left the country, the entire investigation might collapse without his testimony and access to crucial financial documentation. Tyler had already checked in for his flight, and I had no idea how much time we had left before he disappeared beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. If he made it out of the country, it would be game over for justice and accountability. The FBI had to act fast before crucial evidence and testimony disappeared forever, along with Tyler's escape to international sanctuary. The fight had taken everything from me over the past 2 years of relentless legal warfare against corporate corruption and systematic property theft. I had spent years fighting for what was right, but the cost was unimaginable in terms of personal relationships, financial stability, and emotional well-being that I had sacrificed in pursuit of justice for my family and other victims. I hadn't realized how much this battle would drain me physically and mentally, affecting my health, my relationships with friends and family, and my basic peace of mind that had been destroyed by constant stress and conflict. Sleep disorders persisted long after the immediate threats ended, and my doctor warned about stress-related health problems that could affect me for years. But when I thought about what was at stake for other families facing similar property theft and systematic fraud, I knew I couldn't stop fighting until justice was achieved and accountability was established for everyone involved in the criminal conspiracy. The principle of property rights and legal protection for vulnerable communities was worth any personal sacrifice, especially when the alternative was allowing systematic corruption to continue targeting rural landowners who lacked resources to defend themselves against sophisticated legal manipulation. My grandfather's legacy and the dreams of countless families depended on exposing this corruption completely and ensuring it could never happen again. Federal agents arrested Tyler Morrison at the airport just 40 minutes before his scheduled flight to Switzerland, preventing his escape and preserving crucial evidence that would be essential for prosecuting the entire criminal organization. His arrest triggered a coordinated series of raids and evidence preservation actions that secured financial records, business communications, and physical documentation that revealed the full scope of systematic property acquisition activities involving multiple states and communities. The takedown involved over 50 federal agents working simultaneously across 6 different locations to prevent evidence destruction and ensure comprehensive evidence preservation. Tyler's cooperation with federal investigators provided access to offshore financial accounts and international business relationships that exposed additional layers of criminal activity involving money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that would support comprehensive prosecution of everyone involved. His detailed knowledge of internal operations and financial procedures enabled federal prosecutors to build cases that would result in substantial prison sentences and asset forfeiture proceedings that would recover stolen property for victim compensation. Banking records from 12 different countries revealed the international scope of their money laundering operations. Catherine Sterling was arrested at her lakefront mansion during a dawn raid that also secured computers, financial records, and business communications that documented her central role in coordinating systematic property theft through exploitation of municipal legal procedures. The evidence recovered during the raid revealed the sophisticated nature of her criminal organization and the substantial profits generated through systematic fraud targeting vulnerable property owners throughout the region. FBI forensic accountants estimated that the criminal organization had stolen over $40 million in property value through fraudulent acquisition schemes. It was surreal watching Catherine's empire crumble as federal investigators documented the scope of her criminal activities and prepared comprehensive charges that would result in decades of prison time and complete forfeiture of assets acquired through systematic fraud. Seeing her mansion go under federal auction, knowing that all her manipulation and corruption had finally caught up with her, represented poetic justice for families who had lost their generational property through her systematic theft and legal manipulation. The auction of her assets alone recovered over $12 million for victim compensation funds. This wasn't just about recovering my family's land anymore, though that remained personally important for honoring my grandfather's legacy and maintaining generational property that represented decades of hard work and sacrifice. It was about righting the wrongs she had inflicted on families throughout the region and establishing legal precedents that would protect future property owners from similar systematic fraud and corporate exploitation of municipal legal procedures. The case would be studied in law schools as an example of how corporate corruption could be systematically prosecuted and defeated. Federal prosecution resulted in comprehensive convictions and substantial prison sentences for everyone involved in the criminal conspiracy, with Catherine Sterling receiving 25 years in federal prison and Tyler Morrison receiving 18 years plus complete asset forfeiture. The sentences reflected the serious nature of systematic fraud and the substantial financial losses inflicted on victim families who had lost generational property through criminal exploitation of legal procedures. 14 other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, ensuring that the entire criminal organization was dismantled completely. Asset recovery proceedings enabled federal authorities to return stolen property to original owners and provide financial compensation for families who had suffered losses through the systematic property acquisition scheme. My family's 200 acres were restored to rightful ownership, along with additional compensation for legal expenses and financial losses incurred during the prolonged legal battle against criminal conspiracy. Over 300 families throughout 6 states recovered their stolen property or received substantial financial compensation for their losses. The broader impact of the federal prosecution extended beyond individual property recovery to include legislative reforms and regulatory changes that would prevent similar systematic fraud in the future. New federal oversight of municipal tax collection procedures and development corporation activities would protect vulnerable property owners from exploitation through legal loopholes and procedural manipulation that had enabled systematic property theft. The Sterling Act, named after the case, created federal criminal penalties for systematic property acquisition fraud. Community healing began slowly as residents recognized the scope of corruption that had threatened property rights and community stability through systematic exploitation by connected insiders who had used positions of trust for personal financial gain. Property values increased throughout the region as federal prosecution eliminated the artificial market manipulation and fraudulent property acquisition activities that had distorted normal real estate transactions. Real estate markets, stabilized as legitimate development, could proceed without fraudulent competition from criminal organizations. The Justice Center I established on the recovered property became a resource for other communities facing similar challenges with corporate corruption and systematic property theft. Legal aid services and educational programs helped property owners understand their rights and recognize warning signs of fraudulent acquisition schemes that exploited municipal legal procedures for private financial gain at the expense of legitimate property rights. The center provided free legal assistance to over 500 families in its first year of operation. My relationship with the land was forever changed by the experience of nearly losing everything my grandfather had built, and the realization that property rights depend on constant vigilance against systematic corruption and corporate exploitation. The victory felt complete in terms of justice achieved and accountability established, but the emotional scars from years of legal warfare would take much longer to heal than the formal resolution of criminal charges. Counseling and therapy helped process the trauma, but trust in institutions remained permanently affected by the experience. Standing on the same land my grandfather had cleared and developed through decades of hard work, I felt his presence and his approval for the fight I'd waged to protect his legacy from systematic theft and corporate corruption. The bronze plaque I installed near the main entrance to the Justice Center reads, "In memory of those who lost land to corporate greed, in honor of those who fight back against systematic corruption. Annual memorial services honor families affected by similar fraud throughout the region." As Catherine was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was just the beginning of a larger fight against corporate corruption. The satisfaction of justice felt real, but I knew this struggle wasn't over. Legislative reforms and federal oversight would help, but the battle for property rights will never truly end. It's a fight against corporate interests who see land as profit, not protection. If you're still with me, let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the thanks button if you want to support. Stay strong and keep fighting for what's right. Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier.